Rick Murray, executive producer of Janet Jackson. You and your team met her 5 years ago for a completely different project. So how did that one-off shoot turn into a 4-part documentary series?
It's a good question. I think the answer is with a lot of tenacity and kind of wishful thinking, it felt like to begin with. But yeah, Janet, I think the other project you're referring to is Janet, and it was looking for someone to film a behind the scenes tour documentary. She'd taken some time out to have a baby at the age of 50, which in itself is amazing. And she was coming back on tour after suspending her tour, and she wanted to document it. And I think from the moment we were invited, we were like, well, yeah, of course, we'd love to come and make a tour documentary with you. However, it just felt that the Janet Jackson story hadn't been told. And from day one of going out to make that tour documentary, our sort of secret mission really was to try and persuade her to do a much bigger project and to make a feature film, you know, that tells her angle of the whole story, the whole Jackson story, right?
So how confident were you that you could persuade her to sign on to this?
Well, we didn't know her, so we didn't know whether she'd be in that sort of frame of mind. I mean, all we knew about her to begin with was that she's an incredibly private person, and apart from a couple of appearances on Oprah and you know, maybe the Letterman show, she hadn't really spoken much in public about her private life, about the sort of story behind her success, the various struggles that she'd faced. And so we really went in there, like I say, with a bit of wishful thinking. But Ben, the director that we sent, he spent, you know, the whole tour with her, kind of trying to sit her down and I suppose get more out of her than just talking about that particular moment in time. And I think that, you know, about 3 or 4 weeks into it, he called me in the middle of the night, really excited, and said, we just sat down for a 20-minute interview, but it went on for 3 hours, and we spoke about everything. And a lot of that 3-hour interview formed a good chunk, actually, of the final 4-part series that we made for Lifetime. So, yeah, that shows you how in-depth that was.
Mm-hmm. That has to be the key, right? Like it's Ben Hirsch, the director. Like he has to gain her trust, right, for her to open up. I guess, and then like as you watch the show, you see that they have this like friendship, and she like teases him, and like she says his name. It's like, oh no, Ben, like, or she's like, oh, okay, that's enough, Ben, and they have like a really close bond. But like to your point about her being really private, there's a lot of sensitive topics that she has not talked in depth about that she goes into here, like starting from her childhood. So how did you guys plan to like broach those subjects with her, like knowing that Ben has formed this close relationship with her now?
Yeah, I mean, I think we described the project to her from the outset as one of those projects where this is going to be the definitive story of you. And so we have to touch on all the successes, but we also have to touch on the hard times, and we have to ask the difficult questions. And obviously we collaborated with Janet. It was an authorized doc. So she, you know, was an EP on the project and was able to work with us to sort of formulate you know, the way that we would tell her story. But what we were really clear about is that if we're going to do this, we have to answer every single question. You know, what those answers are, that's your voice. Your voice, this documentary is your voice. But we can't have people watch it and say, well, why didn't they ask her about that? And I think that is what we managed to achieve, was a sort of honest kind of roundup of everything, no matter how difficult it was. And you got to hear her views on all the sort of tricky subjects. I think how we went about it, it was so important, that relationship she had with Ben. They got on really, really well. They both had young children and kind of bonded over that. And I think that throughout her life, she's had guys follow her around with cameras, but it's never actually amounted to the big documentary. So we were kind of nervous that he might be another one of those guys. But we did manage to actually take it from that process through and see the documentary released, which we were delighted about. And I think it was just persistence on Ben's part. And he just asked the questions, and sometimes she wasn't in the mood to answer them, and sometimes she was. And eventually, over the course of 2 or 3 years of filming, we kind of had everything that we needed to sort of join all the dots in her story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, as you watch, it becomes clear that the theme of the series and also her life and career is about control, no pun intended. But when did you guys realize that as you were filming her and talking to her through the years?
Yeah, definitely super early on, because that first 3-hour interview session that Ben did, it was kind of like a therapy session. We were like, come on, take us all the way back to the start. And she was talking about all the big influences in her life, which were her dad, her brothers, especially Michael, and then, her music kind of came out of those relationships, and what those control was about, her taking control back from her father. And certainly, I think a lot of the music that she released in the late 80s and 90s, she wasn't in direct competition with Michael, but she felt this pressure to perform because her brother was Michael Jackson. So everything she did was kind of shaped by those relationships in her life, especially the male relationships, all the way up to the Super Bowl and her relationship with Justin Timberlake and their friendship around that, and the huge kind of scandal, that saw it being, blasted through the White House and huge fines handed out to networks. So we just saw this common theme of control and her trying to grasp it, usually from men. And so then you're looking at really interesting themes there of sexism and sometimes racism, and the way that the industry treats people, especially women and women of color, which, I think is a fascinating backdrop for her career, which is still a record-breaking career, against the odds, really.
Yeah, for sure. And you guys also had so much home video footage that one of her ex-husbands, Renee Elizondo, he filmed. And then we see how, even through those home videos, how their relationship deteriorated and why they divorced and everything. And again, like you're saying, it's like the male figures in her life and the need for control. And but I love some of the footage that you guys included, like her and Michael writing Scream in his bedroom apartment in New York. And then there's also her arguing with Jimmy Jam in the studio because he wanted more energy out of her as she was laying down a track, and she just walks out the studio. So can you talk about just combing through all that footage and just finding all this stuff that no one has ever seen before, the public, I mean?
Yeah. Well, it all sat in a lockup in LA somewhere, and during lockdown, she said, I'm going to send you my personal archive. We're like, okay, cool. Roughly how many tapes or drives? So she said 7,000 tapes. This is her archivist, 7,000 tapes. So we basically had everything from the kind of mid-70s, everything she was involved in. If she was given a copy of it or a rough cut for review, she kept it, she put it in her archive. So we ended up with both, cuts of never seen before cuts that other people had shot of her work, but also her own huge personal archive, her home videos. And Renee, her second husband, was a cameraman and kind of took it upon himself to film almost a decade of her life, which was amazing. And he was one of those guys who filmed her already and it hadn't come to something. And we got that wonderful gift in the post during lockdown. And we started the process, and it took a huge team months to go through everything with a fine tooth comb. And, amongst the kind of, videos of Renee paintballing or playing golf, then suddenly he'd be in the studio filming the creation, the moment that they created Rhythm Nation, which, like I say, is still a record-breaking hit to this day. It was the biggest selling premiere tour, first-time tour of any artist ever. And there they are, just creating it in the studio. And then even better for us as documentary makers, oh my God, they're falling out over it. They're getting stressed because they've been there for, I think something like 3 months, and the record company are trying to get in and they're keeping them out. And you can just see the tensions rising a little, even though they're all really good friends, and the creative process is fascinating to see. And I wish we'd had more time to dig into that creative process. You know, I really enjoyed the Get Back documentary that Peter Jackson directed, just because it's all about that creative process. And there was certainly a whole nother series we could have made just about how she collaborated with Jimmy Jam in that studio. But certainly in the time that we had, we just tried to tell the story of this pressure mounting and how they reacted to that. And of course, in the end, you know, an amazing track was forged under all that kind of duress, which is testament to those guys, basically.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I think, you know, everyone was probably or definitely waiting to hear her talk about the Super Bowl, because she's kept quiet for the majority of over the years, you know, I guess, what is it now? 18 years? Yeah, 18 years.
Yeah.
And yeah, I like how that segment was shot, because it's a conversation between her and Randy, because Justin asked her to appear when he was headlining in 2018, and she's like, I would love to, but I can't do it. It's just like too much baggage. And then she talks about how right after it happened back then, that she told him not to say anything, like she wanted to protect him. And I think nowadays, you know, her fans like understandably are in her corner trying to protect her and think that she was wrong, but she was looking out for Justin. And I think that's such an interesting new perspective on it. Like, were you surprised about that when they talked about that?
Yeah, we were, because the kind of the narrative now is that Justin, you know, was I guess hung Janet out to dry, because he was there still being invited to the award ceremonies, still allowed on CBS. She was banned. And that ban continued for like well over a decade, I mean, 15 years, whilst he was still in the limelight. So he was the enemy. But in a way, that's, again, it's like the public misconstruing what had happened, because, you know, in the first place, it was kind of the media and the public who kind of blew the whole thing up and then pointed at Janet and said, well, she's to blame. It was her birth. She's to blame. So everyone jumped on her, and then kind of 15, 20 years later, everyone jumps on Justin. But I guess the reality is that those guys are friends, and that they've been trying to deal with this like crazy storm, and what to say in public, and everything they would say would come back to bite them in some way. And I think that she just wanted to protect him and his mental health as well as her own, because the whole thing is pretty nuts, the way that the world reacted to that. And, you know, we did a lot of research on it and spoke to a lot of people who were working at the FCC at the time. And, you know, everyone actually, even the people doing the job and handing out the fines, thought this is a bit crazy, but we've kind of got to go with it, because both Bush and Hillary Clinton are there in the Senate kind of talking about this. We've got to do something and kind of act in a certain way. So it just felt like, you know, a hysteria, really. And those guys are just friends. Like, they're not enemies as a result of it. So hopefully that came across in the show and the way that, you know, she described events. But of course, she just doesn't want to go back there and publicly kind of really, you know, make up at the suit or go back to the Super Bowl. She just wants to move on from it, you know.
Yeah, for sure. And like, she's, you know, released that video as well, like urging fans to move on. Like, she appreciates the support, but it's time to move on, and like they're friends. And she's, I guess, maybe forgiven is like the wrong word to use too, because it was like an accident. But and I guess it's more of like an indictment of like the media and how they treat women, especially back then as well. And you see how her career and his career trajectories were completely different. But like, to that point, it ends with her induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And it was just kind of, you know, like the last couple of years, it was like a new appreciation of her career. Like, everyone was like, we've like treated her like crap since the Super Bowl. And, you know, every Super Bowl is like Janet Jackson Appreciation Day. So can you talk about like how, you know, filming like over the past 5 years, like when that just kind of like coalesced to that point, is like, this is kind of like perfect that like she's getting her due and getting inducted.
Well, it was amazing, because when we set out filming, there are a few things really that she didn't have closure on at that point, and that closure kind of came during the filming period. And I think certainly that was a huge one for her and her career. You know, she'd been eligible, I think, for nearly 10 years to be in the Hall of Fame, but she hadn't been accepted by the committee, despite a lot of lobbying. And of course, with the Me Too movement, people started looking back at the mid-noughties and the early sort of 2000s and saying, well, hold on, why did we behave like that? What were we thinking? Like, was it actually fair to treat her like that, but not treat Justin in the same way? And actually, was it an overreaction? And I think suddenly with that hindsight, you know, not just the board of the Hall of Fame, but probably America moved on from it. And it's great to see her getting all the kind of accolade now that she deserves, because there was a kind of wilderness period of well over a decade where she, you know, people kind of didn't erase her from history, but she wasn't talked about as much as a legend like that probably should be, right? So I think that was a great sort of, you know, that happening in 2019, huge piece of closure on her career, and means she can sort of finally move on from it, which is a lovely end to the series for us, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Rick, it was great speaking with you. Thanks so much for your time.